So in that last lecture, we looked at the drugs of abuse, and now we're going to look at the consequences of misuse of drugs, and notably addiction and dependence. This can have fatal consequences at worst, but it's a topic that, like the other one, like the drugs of abuse, it's a topic that has many strands to it. It's psychology, it's physiology, it's pharmacology, it's neuroscience. And we need to think about the psychology a little bit more in this presentation, because we're going to look at addiction as really as a psychological illness, and I think it's reasonable to think of it in that way. Dependence we will think of more as a physiological response, as we'll see as we move on. So why do people take drugs? Well, really because it makes them feel fantastic. You wouldn't take drugs if it didn't make you feel good. And there is no doubt that smoking crack or taking heroin gives you the most fantastic rush. People talk about a kind of full body orgasm. And I guess that makes sense. That rush of dopamine and serotonin is hugely enjoyable, so much so that if you get caught up in that habit, then you will spend the rest of your days chasing that rush, that feeling, until you manage to get off the drugs. So that's why people take drugs. I love this quote from Aldous Huxley's Brave New World that 2,000 pharmacologists and biochemists were subsidised. 6 years later it was being produced commercially, the perfect drug, euphoric, narcotic, pleasantly hallucinant. All the advantages of Christianity and alcohol, none of their defects. Take a holiday from reality whenever you like and come back without so much as a headache or a mythology. Stability was practically assured. Imagine a drug like heroin, crack cocaine, crystal meth, a drug that could give you that kind of pleasurable sensation, feeling, without any risk to your respiration or causing you to become addicted and losing your family, your life, whatever the consequence of that might be. The sad fact is that it's extremely harmful. But look at these numbers in this panel here. These are annual related deaths in England and Wales, and Scottish figures come next. I mean, these are deaths. The bulk of the deaths, as you see here, are related to smoking and alcohol. And remember back to that drugs of abuse lecture. The drugs were categorised A, B and C based on the harm that they do. Why on earth then is smoking and alcohol not contained within that table? We can only assume it's because these are hugely lucrative in terms of tax revenue that is gathered. We can see from the bottom here 10 drug crimes every day in Scotland, and Strathclyde alone has about 152 known gangs and 92% of them dealing in A-class drugs. So this is a problem for Scotland. And here are the death rates in Scotland. I won't go through this table, you can look at it in your own time. Suffice to say that we are not winning the war on drugs. Begs the question, should there be a war on drugs? And there's a lot of debate to be had about the merits of legalising the drugs which are misused. And there's strong debates for and against on both sides of that argument. So let's think about some terminologies. So drug abuse or substance abuse. What do we mean by that? Well, one definition is a persistent or sporadic excessive drug use inconsistent with or unrelated to acceptable medical practice. That's the World Health Organization expert committee's definition. So it's drugs which are used in a fashion which is not prescribed. Could be said to be drug abuse or substance abuse. Addiction. Addiction is believed to be a mental process. It's a psychological condition of being addicted. It comes from the word addictus. Some of the literature will suggest that addictus means to be a slave to something. And I believe in ancient Greek or ancient Roman times, whenever it was, that if you had committed a crime, that in order to pay back the person whom you had made the crime against, you would be made to serve them for a period of time, and that you would be addicted to them. You would be joined to them. You could not escape from them. And that's really what addiction is. It's an inability to escape from the craving, right? The obsession and the craving. Dependence, on the other hand, is more of a physical trait. At its weakest, you could say that perhaps somebody who was a heavy smoker who didn't have access to their cigarettes might get a little bit narky. You can get some people that when they get hungry, they get a little bit irritable and get a bit narky. Is that a physical reaction? Maybe, maybe not. But one thing's for sure is that going cold turkey and coming off a really hard drug, there is a physical response, a physiological response. Shakes, shivers, cold sweats, it's actually measurable. And at that point, when your body exhibits a response to the absence of the drug, then I think you could say that you are dependent on the substance. So addiction and dependence, non-disordered drug use, disordered drug use, non-disordered drug use, seems a strange phrase, but obsessions and compulsions and cravings are common, right? So I think you know what addiction and dependence is. Tolerance is fairly common in pharmacology. Sometimes you might refer to it as tachyphylaxis. This is where you would give a dose of a drug and the drug would give you a response, but if you then gave that same dose again, the drug gives you a smaller response. And the reason for that is that the activation of the receptor causes the receptor to downregulate, either in number or in sensitivity, but the response of the receptor to that particular drug is depleted. So if we were to take a control concentration response curve to a particular drug dose, and here's our control curve here, that if we were very sensitive to this, then the curve would be shifted to the left. You become sensitized, and this might happen. You might have heard of denervation supersensitivity. This is where you remove a particular neurotransmitter and the receptors upregulate in response. But what we're talking about here is the opposite, that after continued use of a drug, you develop tolerance. And what that means is that in order to get a response, let's say 50% of the response, if you become tolerant, you need more drug. And that's a classic problem that's encountered by most drug addicts, that after a relatively short time, you need more and more of the same drug in order to achieve the same response. You become tolerant. I put up a little graphic here of this book here, Gabor Mate's In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. If you're interested in addiction and what might lead to addiction, you might be interested in this book. I think it's a bit overlong and kind of restates the point time and time again, but the basic thesis here is that people who become addicted are generally running away from something, some traumatic event in their life, and certainly Matty provides that evidence in the book, but I've read and seen other reports that suggest that perhaps it's not quite as simple as that. Okay, so let's think about different routes of taking drugs. So why is it sometimes you would go for intravenous? Or why might you smoke it? Why might you snort it, take it up your nose? Or why might you eat it? Well, it depends on the concentration and the quantity of drug that you have. Let's look at plasma concentration levels here on this graph. And let's look at an IV response to a drug, whatever drug it might be. And we're starting at a 0.6 milligrams per kilogram. What you see, of course, here is a very rapid response, okay, which falls away. Now that rapid response will be normally associated with what's referred to as the rush, the sudden onset effect of the drug, and often that's what drug users are craving, that burst of activity, that rush. If you were to smoke the same drug, then you don't get quite the same, you get quite a fast effect. Probably doesn't reach the same level and tops off and starts to fall, but you certainly still get a relatively rapid rush. But of course, smoking drugs will be quite wasteful because you've seen it. People smoke pipes or they smoke on tin foil. You could smoke in a bottle, in a bong, but which probably won't waste any if you then clean it in the correct way. But in general, smoking would be slightly more wasteful. If you go for a nasal approach, that is snorting through the nose, you'll see that it's a slightly slower rise. So here we've got 0 to 60 minutes. So you can see that it's taken, 30 to 40 minutes or so to take effect. And often that could be fine for some circumstances, but often that's not what is being what's being sought after. And then we've got the oral type. So I mean, this could be just swallowing pills, or for cannabis it could be eating, space cookies or whatever you want to cook up cannabis in. Here it's shown taking about an hour or more. Sometimes it can take up to an hour and a half or 2 hours for you to start to feel the effects. You can see here though that you're having to then use slightly higher concentrations of 2 milligrams per kilogram for an oral dose to be effective, rather than 0.6 milligrams for an IV, where it's straight into the bloodstream and you're kind of wasting nothing. So you can see that if you want a fast rush and if you have limited amounts of drug, then IV is the way to go. And of course that comes with all sorts of problems with dirty needles and infection and so on, and also can lead to overdose. The intoxication levels you can look at in your own time. You'll see that they follow pretty much the same pattern for the plasma concentrations. I love this book, Memoirs of an Addicted Brain by Mark Lewis. He is he is now a professor of neuroscience, but he was once a drug addict who his life was a mess. He says this in the book. But what I like about the book is that with each chapter he describes the particular point in his life that he was at, whether it was robbing pharmacies to steal cough medicine and pills, right up to scoring heroin in various dodgy places around the world. And in each chapter he tells you about a particular drug that he was taking at that time in the first half of the chapter. Then in the second half of the chapter he talks about the neuroscience of it, since he's now a professor of neuroscience. So if you're interested in drugs of abuse and and their pharmacology and the neuroscience, I would recommend this book to you. I found it particularly entertaining and informative. This figure here is from Rang and Dale, and basically what it's saying is that the social situation, purchase of drugs, the preparation of drugs, gives you a positive conditioning. That's absolutely the case, you know. The drug users will look forward to that weekend, like next weekend, if that's the thing, you know, you meet your friends and you take drugs at the weekend. That becomes a positive reinforcing effect, that you know that sometime in the future you're going to have a really nice time with your friends taking drugs, and it's going to lead to a reward. So psychologically this becomes, you know, a rewarding experience, thinking about what might happen. You know that when you take the drugs, you get a positive reinforcement. And so what that tells your brain is that anticipation was correct, you know, because when we took the drugs, we got that response. So the effect of the drug, the reward that you get, is both physical and emotional, in a sense that it's backed up by this positive conditioning. On the other hand, what you come to realise is that, what about the times when there's no drugs available? The word on the street is nobody's got anything. This becomes negative conditioning. Right? You realise that, wait a minute, next weekend's not going to happen. If you're particularly too far down the particular drug route, then you might experience drug withdrawal, which is a negative reinforcement. So you start to get that physical response of not having the drugs, and that is supported by the negative feeling of knowing what's going to happen when no drugs are available, and this reinforces. So there is both positive and negative reinforcements. And the question that's raised in Rang and Dale is that, can we use an agonist drug to minimize the abstinence syndrome, and can we use antagonist drugs to minimize the reward? So can drugs be used in both sides of this equation to try to minimize the effects? So I showed the reward pathway in the previous lecture, and I'll leave in here the figure legend for this diagram just so that it gives you something to revise on. And we'll look in a little bit more detail now at that reward pathway. So we mentioned the ventral tegmental area here in the previous lecture, and we talked about the dopaminergic nerves that go to the nucleus accumbens and the amygdala down here, which is involved in emotional responses. We see here, of course, that the dopaminergic nerves go up into the prefrontal cortex, and remember that's an area that's involved in decision making, organisation and planning. There's also a feedback from the nucleus accumbens. You see in the blue line here, there's a feedback that comes back to the ventral tegmental area. And look at the green diagrams here, sorry, the green symbols here. These are all the opioid containing nerves, and you can see lots of targets for opioid drugs. Look at where the nicotine receptors are. Here, in nerves going into the amygdala. Here, in the nucleus accumbens, here in the ventral tegmental area. It's no wonder, is it, that nicotine is quite a potent and addictive drug. And the blue areas that you see are those areas of your brain that are affected by alcohol. As you can see, fairly large areas, including the nucleus accumbens and the amygdala. So again, we see the potency of nicotine and alcohol in the reward pathway. So the rituals are really quite important. You know, this quote here, I love this. The ritual of scoring the drugs, preparing the works and shooting up was as much a part of Joanna's addiction as the drug itself. It's absolutely the case that the ritual of going out and scoring drugs is in itself partly a high. And this experiment by Alexander et al., the rat park experiment, raised the question of whether or not the addiction that was experienced by a group of experimental rats was a true addiction, or was it an addiction and a dependence, or was it about the environment that the rats were kept in? And if we extrapolate this to humans, the question being asked is the environment in which the human lives, the social circles, the friends that we all have, how much of an influence are they? How's that? You know, if you hang around with a lot of friends who are taking drugs, is it more likely that you will become involved yourself? The experiment was really interesting. So there were some rats that were seemingly addicted to cocaine, I think it was, yeah. And the reason this was believed to be the case was that the rats were living in a cage in some experimental facility. So they're just living in a fairly dull cage. They have the choice of 2 bottles of water. One bottle of water is just normal water, and the other bottle of water is water that is laced with cocaine, which I believe has a slightly bitter taste. Now, we don't know whether or not rats taste the difference, or whether or not it tastes sweet to the rats or whatever, but it's certainly the case that those rats in the cage always chose to take the cocaine laced water. And so the assumption was therefore that, well, the rats are possibly addicted to the cocaine. They then take the rats out of their environment and they put them in Rat Park. And you can see Rat Park here looks kind of like a bit of a Disney World for rats. Looks like they're in a forest and they've got things to play on, and they've got 2 bottles of water to choose from, as you see here. And it was a surprise that the rats that had previously been thought to be addicted to the drug ended up drinking the clean water rather than the drug-laced water. And the conclusion from the work was that if you took the rats out of an environment where it was fairly boring, where really there was no stimulation, no other stimulus for them, then they wouldn't choose to take the drugs. You know, so there was no addiction in this case. An interesting experiment that's worth thinking about.